So the first step to throwing on the potter's wheel is getting your clay in center of the wheel. If we throw off center, the whole cylinder is going to be thick on one side and thin on the other side. So we need to make sure the clay is in center, and in this video that's what I'm going to show you. We're going to be using our hands as our tools. So I really highly recommend you to explore your hands and start thinking about them as your main tools. So we're going to look at the planes of our hands. We're going to be looking at how to use different muscles of our hands, and your bones. Your bones are incredibly important and how we use those. And just to also remember that this skill of throwing on the potter's wheel takes a lot of time to program and embed that micro intelligence in our hands that we're not used to using on a daily basis. So it takes repetition and it takes time, but be patient with yourself and you will get there. Okay, so to start throwing a cylinder, as I said earlier, we need to make sure our clay is centered. And the first step of that is to look at your clay that you're starting with and make sure that there are no creases in the clay. So iron those out with your finger. And also just make sure to really start with a nice round ball of clay. So to get your clay round, you can throw it between your hands using centrifugal force and mold it slightly. It doesn't have to be perfect, don't get obsessed with this, but just try and get your clay as even as possible because it will make your centering easier. And then start by throwing the clay onto the wheel head. Important that you throw it with quite a lot of force so that it suctions onto the wheel. And now you can see it's not centered. So I'm going to break our first golden rule, which is that you never touch the wheel when it's not spinning. Except in this first case, I can nudge it over ever so slightly. I'm now going to turn on my wheel, sorry for the noise. And I'm going to break our second golden rule, which is that you never touch the clay without water on your hands. So with a dry finger, I'm going to just pull the clay down slightly onto the wheel head. This creates a bit of a seal. So you can imagine you're doing almost like that action with your fingers, but while the wheel is spinning, blending it onto the wheel head. And this will stop water from getting underneath and stop your clay from slipping around. And now, from now on, you need to get used to working with the wheel and the clay spinning, and make sure that your hands are always wet. So I'm going to dip my hands in some water, coat the pot in the water, and make sure my wheel is spinning really fast. And everything about throwing is about connectivity. So that's our third golden rule, connectivity. So either have your body locked onto the basin of the wheel, depending on the height of you or the height of your wheel, or onto your body, onto the sides of your waist. If I'm centered, the clay will be centered. That's really all it boils down to. So you can see now the clay is not centered because my hands are moving. If they're wobbling all over the place, this means the clay is not centered. If it looks like the clay is moving, it's not centered. So step one of centering is I'm going to hold the clay in a circle like this around it and use the bones of the heel of my hand to push away from me, and then the bones of my fingers to squeeze towards me. So pushing away and squeezing towards you, allowing the clay to move up between your hands. And in order to do this, to get that clay to move up, I'm overlapping my fingers so that I can make a smaller space for the clay that it has to move through. So bringing it up, and that's step one, that's called coning. And then we're going to make sure it's wet and push the clay down. But as I said, everything in throwing is about connectivity, so I'm not going to just do it with one hand. If I do that, the clay is going to flop all over the place. I'm going to wrap my left hand around the clay and push down with my right hand so that I've got quite a lot of force. If you see what I'm doing with just my left hand, I'm pushing with quite a lot of force. It's bending over with my left hand and then guiding the clay down into the center with my right hand. Okay, so those two steps repeated, that's all we're doing. Bringing the clay up and pushing it down. So step one, make sure it's wet, wrap my hands around the clay and squeeze it it up, making the circle of my hands tighter and smaller so that the clay is forced up. And you can see my hands are moving with the clay. That's a cone, so it looks like an upside down ice cream cone. Then step 2, do a sort of almost karate chop movement. So for this I'm using this plane on the side of my hand to push down. What does help is if you hold your thumb. So if I wrap my hand around and hold my left thumb with my right hand and push down, that'll get me to use the correct part of my hand. You can see where the clay was touching my hand. So I'm going to use the correct part of my hand if I hold that grip. Keeping even force, and almost imagine that your fingers are glued together so that they're not moving around. Keeping your left hand really nice and tight and quite a lot of force going in. Lubricate your piece and bring it back up again, squeezing it up, overlapping your fingers and bringing them up. So you can see what parts of my hands I'm using by what's left on my hands of clay. Make sure it's wet, hold my left thumb, wrap my left hand around, press in and then press down from the top, going all the way down. When you get close to the bottom, it helps to dome your clay. So I like to just slightly drop my wrist. You can see I'm getting a bit of a bend in my wrist here, and that helps to just dome it. If that doesn't work for you, you can just hold your hands over it and make it into a bit of a dome. What this does is help prevent what we call the volcano from happening. So as I'm squeezing the clay up to make this coning action, it's got a flat top at the top. So let me just quickly show you. If I start with the clay flat and I cone up, there's a volcano that happens here. This is because I always forget this, the outside is moving faster than the inside. So if we start with a dome, it will match up flat on the top. Can you see there? I don't have that problem of the volcano. The problem with the volcano is that there's too much water moving into the clay and it gets oversaturated, and so by the time you're ready to throw, your clay is a total flop. So it really helps these little micro movements. So one more time, pressing down, wrapping my hand around from the left, holding my left thumb so that I'm using this part of my hand and pushing down. When I get close to the bottom, I'm going to drop my wrist, making it a dome, and then collaring it back up again into that cone shape. So you can see how small my hands become in that collared shape. So where I'm the boss, I have to tell the clay where to go. Another thing that often happens is that this clay on the outside is off center. Everything else is on center, but your foundation is off center. So I used the back of my thumb, my fingernail, to just pull that last little bit off the base, so that when I push down now, I'm pushing down onto a nice centered foundation. And now if I put my hands around the clay, it's perfectly still and centered. So I'm going to make it flat on the top, flat on the sides, and now I'm ready to throw. It should look like a nice flat scone before you start throwing. So just a quick point, one thing that people often struggle with, is the volcano, which we've shown you already, but another thing is something we call the mushroom top. So when you're centering, if you push down too hard, so after we've coned it up, if we push down too hard with just our right hand and my left hand is floating here, not doing very much, I get what we call the mushroom top. So when you see this, it means that your pressure is not evenly applied between your hands. So like I said earlier, here, let me just cone it back up. It's very important to press quite hard with your left hand. Try and imagine that your fingers are glued together, and keep an even pressure between all your fingers as you're pressing down. Use your bones to press. Try and remember that. So I'm using the bone of my hand here to press down, and my fingers are pressing evenly. My thumb is out of the way. You can either hold it or just keep it out of the way. And then I'm lightly pressing down from the top. So it's an equal pressure between my hands.